She stood still as the others saluted, her arms by her sides, her expression unreadable. To those watching, it looked like the ultimate act of defiance, a reckless insult to a powerful man. But what no one saw, what no one could have known in that moment, was that her refusal to raise her hand would ripple far beyond that parade ground, preventing a brutal order from being carried out and exposing a darkness buried deep within the ranks. This is the story of how one young officer, barely out of academy training, challenged the chain of command not with violence or rebellion, but with silence, restraint, and an unshakable belief in her conscience. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like most others at Fort Ehrenvale, a military outpost perched near the craggy border of the Arivian Highlands, a region still simmering with the memory of conflict. The troops had been instructed to prepare for the annual inspection, a tradition that had evolved into more of a spectacle than a routine check. The base was under the direct authority of Commander Ulrich Den, a decorated officer with a long, if controversial, history of leading border campaigns. His presence alone stirred unease in many, though few ever voiced it. He was the kind of man who inspired both admiration and fear, a figure wrapped in medals and mystery, known for strategic brilliance and rumored ruthlessness. Among the sea of neatly pressed uniforms and polished boots that lined the parade grounds was Second Lieutenant Isla Merin, recently assigned to logistics but temporarily attached to the ceremonial unit for the inspection. She was 24, composed, and quiet in demeanor, with a reputation for precision and uncommon composure. Born in the quiet farming village of Velinor, Lyra's journey to this military outpost had not been traditional. She had entered the academy not out of family pride or ambition, but after witnessing the slow dismantling of her hometown by opportunistic private forces during the years of instability that followed the Treaty of Carowand. She had seen what happened when people in power were never questioned. As the morning sun climbed higher, heat shimmered off the cracked pavement of the base courtyard, amplifying the pressure in the air. The battalion stood at attention, 1,000 pairs of boots perfectly aligned. Commander Dennis approached with his entourage of aides and junior officers, his stride clipped and sharp, his eyes scanning every face. The ceremony was simple in structure: step forward, salute, receive acknowledgement. But it was more than formality. It was submission, ritualized. It was loyalty displayed not to an ideal, but to a man. Lyra had spent the previous night in restless thought, running the scenario over and over again in her mind. Not out of rebellion, but because she had seen something she couldn't unsee. 3 nights earlier, Lyra had been working late in the operations archive, cross-referencing outdated supply logs, when she discovered a restricted operations directive mislabeled in a routine file. Her clearance shouldn't have granted her access to its contents, but the misclassification made it readable. What she read stunned her. It wasn't a plan for patrol shifts or maintenance. It was a preparation document for a containment initiative in the nearby village of Merowend, which had been flagged for preemptive disruption due to suspected insurgent sympathy. The language was coded but chilling. Elimination of disruptive civilian elements, coercive asset control, non-media visible outcomes. Lyra had grown up near Merowend. She knew its people, farmers, artisans, families, and she knew what those words really meant. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she quietly began to gather what she could: copies of communications, timestamps, records of troop assignments. It became clear that the directive was scheduled to be authorized following the inspection, the, quote, ceremonial clearance, acting as a symbolic final blessing from the commander before operations commenced. She could not go through the chain of command. Den was the chain. She could not alert local authorities. Her clearance breach would be discovered before she finished her sentence. So she settled on one thing she could control: the moment of the salute. As Commander Den approached her row, each officer in front of her lifted their arm sharply, crisp, and clean. Den would nod slightly in return, his eyes cool and searching. When he stopped before her, Lyra held her posture, but her arm did not rise. Her eyes met his with steady resolve. The silence between them was noticeable, uncomfortable. Whispers flickered down the line like wind through dry grass. The moments stretched long. Then, with no acknowledgement, Dens moved on. But the tension didn't. It stayed suspended in the air like a live wire. What followed was swift. She was summoned within the hour to his office. Questions. Accusations. Dens was furious but also intrigued. "Why?" he asked, not in a shout but a whisper. She gave no answer. Not yet. Because she knew that refusing to salute wasn't just about defiance. It was bait, and someone had taken it. That night, she received a message from someone she didn't expect, Captain Bren Idros, an intelligence officer known for his discretion and allegiance to procedure. His note was brief. "We need to talk. I know what you saw." And so the story truly began. Because Lyra had cracked something open, not just a file, but a fracture in a structure built on fear and obedience. And soon, that quiet refusal would force a reckoning that would change the course of more than just one operation. It would expose a hidden system of silent approvals, implicate powerful figures, and ultimately halt a series of brutal actions before they could begin, all because one officer chose not to raise her hand. Lyra Malkin was not the kind of person people noticed first. She had a way of moving through rooms with quiet efficiency, offering just enough presence to be polite, but never enough to draw attention. She stood at an even 5'7", lean from daily training, with dark brown hair always pulled back in a neat regulation braid. Her eyes, a muted green, often gave away more than her words ever did. To her colleagues, she was competent, measured, and predictably reserved. Never the loudest voice in a meeting, never the one to stir debate, always completing assignments early and exactly as required. She was, by all appearances, the textbook model of a junior officer. But what most of them didn't realize was that Lyra had spent her entire life learning how to appear that way, how to disappear just enough to be safe, how to observe without being observed. Born to a schoolteacher and a seamstress in the quiet hills of Velinor, Lyra's early life had been simple, almost idyllic. Her parents taught her the value of questions more than answers, and her mother often said that silence was the truest mirror of a person's intentions. Their home was filled with books, mismatched furniture, and the warmth of home-cooked meals. But even that little village, surrounded by green fields and mist-covered hills, had not been immune to the aftershocks of the Great Reconciliation War. When Lyra was 12, she witnessed soldiers storm her neighbor's property on accusations of harboring, quote, foreign-funded agitators. The accusations were false. She knew this. Everyone in the village did. But that didn't stop the destruction. That night, she saw her friend's father taken away in handcuffs, and she saw no one speak up. Not the elders, not the mayor, not even her parents. That silence became something heavy that never quite left her. In school, Lyra excelled quietly. She gravitated toward history and language studies, fascinated by how civilizations justified cruelty and how institutions wrapped power in paperwork and policies. She was a naturally curious child, often found scribbling in journals late into the night, chronicling everything from overheard conversations in the marketplace to imagined endings of stories she didn't like. Her teachers praised her for her discipline and clarity, but a few noticed her tendency to flinch when voices were raised or when decisions felt rushed. She had, even then, an instinct for tension, an ability to sense when things didn't quite align. That instinct sharpened over time, honed by years of observation, reinforced by stories of disappearances and quiet retirements that echoed through the countryside. By the time she was 17, Lyra had made a decision that surprised even herself. She applied to the Royal Military Academy in Trinaris, one of the most prestigious and competitive institutions in the country. It wasn't ambition that led her there. It was necessity. She wanted to understand power, not just as a theory in books, but as it was wielded in rooms behind locked doors. She wanted to see how orders were written, who signed them, and how far obedience could be stretched before it broke into complicity. Her parents were hesitant, especially her mother, who had always feared what happened to curious minds in systems built on obedience. But they supported her nonetheless, offering quiet prayers and second-hand suitcases for her journey to the capital. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At the academy, Lyra adapted quickly. She memorized routines, excelled in simulations, and became known for her near-photographic memory of policy codes and engagement protocols. Her superiors praised her restraint. Her peers appreciated her willingness to share notes without ever making them feel inferior. But behind that composed exterior, Lyra kept detailed journals of every interaction, every pattern she noticed, every moment when someone's silence felt louder than their words. She wasn't gathering intelligence, at least not intentionally. She was trying to map the invisible currents that shaped decisions. She had learned early that truth didn't always wear a uniform. Her specialization in logistical coordination gave her access to operational planning, supply chain assessments, and base scheduling. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the kind of position that saw everything, especially the pieces others overlooked. When she graduated, her final report described her as unshakably ethical, detail-oriented, and highly self-regulating. She was offered multiple placement options but chose Fort Ehrenvale, the remote border outpost, because its operational irregularities had quietly interested her. There were patterns in its file histories that didn't match the reports she had studied during her final year. Equipment listed as delivered but never logged in training. Units rotated out without documentation. Brief spikes in emergency funding without accompanying mission records. It was a puzzle. And Lyra had always been drawn to puzzles. When she arrived at Ehrenvale, she was slotted into a mid-tier logistics role, mostly focused on inventory auditing and transportation coordination. She kept her head down, adjusted to the pace, and began learning the unofficial rhythms of the base. The conversations that stopped when certain officers walked by, the shifts that were always understaffed at specific times, the sudden flurries of activity before classified briefings. Over time, she developed a quiet rapport with a few officers, including a technical specialist in communications who let slip one night over coffee that certain channels had been flagged for restricted access without proper citation. Lyra took note, not just of what was said, but how it was said. Fear, she had learned, was often laced with politeness. So by the time the inspection ceremony was announced, Lyra was already deep into a quiet investigation of her own. She had begun to suspect that the commander's ceremonial routine was more than tradition. It was a sign-off for operations that couldn't withstand scrutiny. She had no proof yet, just fragments. But then she found the misfiled directive, and everything clicked. To everyone else, she was still the quiet logistics officer, punctual, reserved, professional. But beneath that calm exterior was a woman who had made a decision long ago, that she would not look away, that silence was never neutral, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room was the one who asked the right question and waited for the answer no one wanted to give. Fort Ehrenvale was the kind of place that revealed itself slowly, like a story too careful to share its ending. Tucked into the barren cliffs just east of the Arivian Highlands, the outpost had once been a fortress during the territorial wars and had since evolved into a strategic listening post, a training site, and a holding station for specialized regiments cycling through classified assignments. The terrain around it was unforgiving, jagged rocks, steep ridges, and dry wind that carried the dust of 1,000 forgotten skirmishes. The soil was too stubborn for crops, and the nearest civilian settlement was over 30 kilometers away, which meant that the base operated like a self-contained ecosystem, its own little nation, with its own rules, rhythms, and secrets. From the outside, Fort Ehrenvale looked deceptively orderly. The perimeter was lined with high fencing and mounted surveillance towers, each sweeping the barren landscape in slow, deliberate arcs. At the gate, Entry logs were kept with military precision, and facial recognition scans recorded every visitor, every delivery. Inside, the buildings were utilitarian, poured concrete, steel supports, minimal windows. Everything about the architecture suggested control, corridors that echoed even quiet footsteps, offices with 2 locks, break rooms furnished with only what was necessary. There were no flowers, no stray decorations, no bulletin boards filled with birthday announcements. The base had long ago replaced humanity with discipline, but beneath that visible order pulsed a different current. There were unspoken hierarchies not reflected on any organizational chart. Officers with identical ranks held wildly different amounts of influence, and reputations carried more weight than official commendations. Commander Dennis sat at the top of it all, not just because of his rank, but because of the mythos built around him. His office overlooked the central training square, and his presence alone could clear a hallway. His staff rarely questioned him, and if they did it cautiously, threading their words with respect and calculated vagueness. He was the kind of leader who remembered every slight, however minor, and who rewarded absolute loyalty with quiet privileges. Extended leave, upgraded quarters, favorable transfers. Erenvale had become his kingdom, and like all kingdoms built on fear, it was fortified not just with fences, but with silence. The base operated on a strict schedule. Morning drills began at 0500 sharp, followed by staggered meal times at the mess hall and afternoon rotations between training, operations, and administrative duties. Lights out was at 2300, but few ever really slept through the night. The halls hummed with the faint buzz of unseen activity, late-night movements of classified cargo, encrypted transmissions sent over secure lines, the hum of drone launches in the North Quadrant. To an outsider, it might seem like a place of tireless military efficiency. To those who lived within it, it was a place where you learned quickly what questions not to ask. Lyra had spent weeks acclimating to the undercurrents. She observed how certain officers always seemed to disappear during particular drills, how requisitions for equipment were often delayed until after inspection tours, how the base's weekly reports didn't always match the internal databases. One day, she noticed a security technician reclassify a transport log while muttering that the vehicle in question had never actually left the bay. Another time, she overheard a medic mention in passing that a soldier had been treated for an injury not listed in any patrol summary. These inconsistencies weren't random. They were part of something, a structure built to obscure, not reveal. And the more she watched, the more she understood. Erenvale wasn't just a base, it was a staging ground. The surrounding region offered little distraction. Beyond the outpost was a stretch of desolate ridges known as the Keldrin Pass, a contested corridor during the war that had been redrawn on maps more times than anyone could count. Now it served as both a buffer zone and a warning. Villages like Morrowind dotted the edge of the pass, isolated, poor, and politically expendable. Most of them had once been caught in the crossfire between nationalist militias and state forces. After the Treaty of Carowend, they were promised rebuilding aid and autonomous governance. But promises in Erenvale's orbit were brittle things, easily rewritten by a classified directive or a change in political wind. The relationship between the base and the surrounding villages was officially cooperative, but informally tense. Supplies passed through local roads, and civilian contractors were occasionally brought in for maintenance or medical aid. But more often than not, those villages were treated as suspicious by default. Lyra had seen it firsthand during a recent cargo escort mission to the outskirts of Morrowind. The soldiers she was accompanying had spoken in hushed tones about preemptive measures and how we'll have to do something about that place eventually. It wasn't said with malice. It was worse than that. It was casual, as if wiping out a village were just a logistical adjustment waiting for approval. Inside the base, there was no formal notice of the upcoming, quote, containment directive Lyra had discovered. No meetings, no tactical drills, nothing visible. It was buried in euphemisms and code phrases, terms like coordinated stability intervention and non-escalatory neutralization. But she could feel it in the air, the way soldiers were being reassigned, how certain storage bays had become restricted, how the officers stopped speaking when she entered a room. The command structure had been mobilized, but not outwardly. This was the kind of operation done in shadows. The inspection ceremony was more than a formality in that context. It was a trigger, an internal signal that the last box had been checked, that Dens had seen everything he needed to see and was ready to issue the final go-ahead. It wasn't just about observing the troops. It was a ritual of dominance, and when Lyra refused to salute, she didn't just break protocol. She disrupted that ritual. She injected a note of discord into a perfectly rehearsed symphony of obedience. And in a place like Erenvale, where even silence had structure, that kind of disruption was dangerous. She knew the base wouldn't collapse overnight. She knew the machinery wouldn't grind to a halt because of one quiet refusal. But she also knew that machinery, once questioned, could no longer claim innocence. Fort Erenvale was not invincible. It was a fortress built on routines, paperwork, and the assumption that no one would ever say no. Lyra had just proven that assumption wrong. And the environment around her, the walls, the corridors, the echoing silence, suddenly felt less like a system and more like a cage with cracks beginning to show. Commander Alric Dens was a man whose name carried more weight than the medals pinned to his chest. To those outside the military, he was known as a war hero, decorated, strategic, and fiercely committed to national security. News outlets featured him in sharp-angled portraits, often with folded arms and a gaze fixed toward some distant horizon, symbolizing unwavering leadership. Within the ranks, however, the image was more complicated. Den was both feared and revered, a figure of icy calculation who demanded absolute control over every unit under his command. He was a tactician of psychological warfare as much as military maneuvers. Subordinates who pleased him were fast-tracked, praised publicly, and shielded from red tape. Those who disappointed him rarely found their careers recoverable. Behind the walls of Fort Erenvale, he was not just the top officer, he was the atmosphere itself. Physically, Den exuded a presence that seemed carved from stone. Towering at 6'3", with silver hair cropped short and a rigid posture that made his uniform seem like an extension of his bones, he moved through the corridors like a specter, unannounced, often silent, yet always known. He rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. One glance from him, one barely perceptible narrowing of the eyes, could unravel an officer's composure. His tone was always steady, his words carefully chosen, laced with the kind of menace that never needed to be explicit. He spoke in the language of command, cold, impersonal, bureaucratically precise. But the true nature of Dens's authority lay not in his demeanor, but in the quiet infrastructure he had built beneath official command lines. Over the course of his career, he had assembled an inner circle of officers, analysts, and operations specialists who were fiercely loyal, not to the military code, but to him personally. These were men and women who owed him favors, promotions, and in some cases, their very reputations. They managed classified directives with surgical discretion, executed orders that never made it into public logs, and maintained a culture of strategic ambiguity. Den believed in control through opacity. The more uncertain his subordinates were about what was really happening, the less likely they were to challenge it. At the heart of his command philosophy was the doctrine of operational fluidity, a euphemism he coined years ago to justify actions that fell outside standard procedure but were deemed necessary for national stability. He argued that the modern battlefield was not confined to front lines, but existed within social structures, village networks, and ideological affiliations. His methods were praised in internal evaluations as innovative and adaptive, though some whispered a different word: extrajudicial. Under his tenure, multiple containment operations had been executed in so-called vulnerable zones, areas where intelligence reports suggested potential unrest. These operations rarely received oversight, and even rarer were they questioned. The outcomes were labeled as successful suppressions of destabilizing threats, but the human cost was buried in vague casualty summaries and closed-loop evaluations. Villages vanished from patrol maps. Civilian fatalities were reframed as involuntary collateral disruptions. The directive Lyra uncovered, the one that triggered everything, was a den's hallmark. It was elegant in its wording, dry in its tone, and buried deep beneath administrative paperwork, giving it plausible deniability. Merin was designated a zone of strategic sensitivity, flagged for a preemptive stabilization effort to neutralize local agitators. The phrasing left no fingerprints, but its implications were unmistakable to anyone who understood the system. Merin wasn't a threat. It was inconvenient. It sat too close to a planned outpost expansion, and its people had grown resistant to relocation offers disguised as development projects. Den didn't want negotiations. He wanted finality. And the containment directive was the first step in ensuring it. His plan relied on silence. Silence from his staff, silence from the ranks, and most of all, silence from the public. Operations like this only functioned when every cog in the machine played its part, when every soldier followed orders, every officer signed off, and every civilian fearfully looked away. The inspection ceremony was, in essence, the final rehearsal. Once Dens approved the unit structure and confirmed operational readiness, the go-ahead would be transmitted under a coded authorization string. The troops, many of whom didn't even know what they were really participating in, would be redirected in small detachments, a training exercise near Merin, a temporary communications outage, and then, after 2 days, a quiet return. Nothing would be reported, nothing would be confirmed. Just another operation in the dust-blown records of Fort Ehrenvale. But what Dennis hadn't anticipated was disruption from someone like Lyra Malkin. He had dealt with insubordination before, but it had always come from the outspoken, the restless, the ones who telegraphed their dissent with subtle defiance or reckless words. Lyra was none of those things. She had been a model officer, efficient, quiet, predictable, which made her refusal to salute not only alarming, it made it dangerous. Because it wasn't the act itself that posed a threat. It was what it represented. It was a fracture in the facade, a deviation from the script. And in a world built on tightly choreographed obedience, even a small deviation could unravel everything. When she was brought to his office that afternoon, Dennis studied her not like a man angered, but like a man trying to identify the exact moment a weapon malfunctioned. He asked her only one question, why? But Lyra gave him nothing, not out of stubbornness, but out of strategy. Because she knew the answer he feared wasn't her defiance, it was her knowledge. And the longer she remained silent, the more he would question how much she had seen, how much she had shared, and who else might be watching. From that point forward, Dennis shifted. He ordered her reassignment to a lower-tier inventory review team, an attempt to isolate and discredit her. He instructed his staff to audit her records, searching for anything that could be used to label her unstable, erratic, or compromised. He initiated the containment operations delay under the guise of tactical reconsideration. But beneath that veneer of calm control, something had cracked in his armor. Lyra had introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty was something Den could not abide. He began pushing back against his own circle, questioning their loyalty, micromanaging every transmission, monitoring staff movement. His grip tightened, and with it, the command structure that once functioned like a flawless machine began to creak under the weight of his paranoia. The conflict had now been set. On one side was a man who had manipulated the system into a weapon of silent domination. On the other, a woman who had chosen, in a single moment, to become a fault line. The base still functioned. Orders were still carried out. But something had changed. A silence had been broken. A challenge had been issued. And for the first time in years, Ulrich Dennis was no longer certain that everyone would look away. For the next few weeks, the unit's rhythm settled into a tense pattern. There was no major engagement, but the undercurrent of uncertainty persisted, made heavier by the weight of secrets. Lyra walked a tightrope, executing her daily duties with mechanical precision, while quietly observing the patterns of movement in nearby villages, decoding the unspoken fear in the eyes of the locals, and documenting details that seemed insignificant to others, but painted a clear picture of growing unrest. Commander Vortan, despite his imposing demeanor, had taken a peculiar interest in Elira's unyielding composure. Where others saluted him without question, Elira's hesitation, though now carefully hidden, had left a mark on him. He began summoning her more often under the pretense of logistical briefings or strategy reviews, but the subtext was clear. He was probing, searching for cracks in her armor, trying to determine whether her resolve was defiance or discipline. She answered his questions respectfully, but never eagerly. Her words were measured, her eyes unwavering, her salute always one fraction of a second slower than the rest. But it was enough to keep her on his radar. One night, she received a summons to the commander's tent, long after usual hours. The interior was dimly lit, the lanterns casting long shadows across maps spread out on the table. Vortan looked up from a folder with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. He gestured for her to enter without speaking. Elira stepped in, spine straight, heart steady. He handed her a document without explanation, a deployment order marked urgent, detailing a raid on a village in the south suspected of harboring resistance fighters. Her heart sank. She recognized the village. She'd been there weeks ago delivering medical supplies. There had been no weapons, no signs of an uprising. Just malnourished families and children too weak to play. She folded the paper carefully, her face giving nothing away. Vortan observed her closely, leaning forward with steepled fingers. He asked her opinion on the operation. She hesitated, then gave a carefully neutral assessment, noting that intelligence was thin and the risks of collateral damage high. He chuckled softly, accusing her of being soft-hearted for a soldier. She neither agreed nor denied, instead redirecting the conversation to logistics. The meeting ended with a nod and a strange glint in Vortan's eye, half amused, half suspicious. The next morning, preparations for the raid began. Troops cleaned their rifles, trucks were loaded with supplies, and communications buzzed with encrypted chatter. Elira, despite her growing dread, carried out her assignments. But beneath her calm exterior, a storm brewed. She couldn't let this happen. Not to those people. She began gathering evidence, maps, dates, reports she'd collected during her visits, quietly assembling a case that might counter the commander's plan. She needed to buy time, delay the operation, or, if possible, stop it entirely. But she knew better than to openly confront him. Instead, she sought an ally in someone unlikely, Captain Reeve, the operations officer known for his strict adherence to protocol and cold detachment. She approached him with caution, choosing her words with surgical care, framing her concerns as logistical inefficiencies and gaps in the intelligence framework. At first, he dismissed her. But Elira presented her documentation, highlighted inconsistencies in the recon reports, pointed out discrepancies in troop movement records that implied the source of intelligence might be compromised. Reeve, though rigid, respected order above all else. After a long silence, he told her he'd look into it. That was all she needed. 2 days passed with no changes, and the raid remained on schedule. Then, late on the third day, Reeve quietly informed Elira that he'd submitted a formal request to review the intel source behind the operation. It wasn't enough to stop the raid, but it might delay it. That same night, Elira received an anonymous message slipped under her quarters door, a torn scrap of paper with only 4 words. "They know. Be ready." She didn't sleep. The next morning, her access to the main command hub was restricted. When she tried to retrieve her case files, her credentials failed. The folder where she kept her reports had vanished. She'd been discovered. Or worse, she was being framed. Vortan didn't confront her directly, but the air around her had changed. Officers avoided her gaze, whispers followed her footsteps, and Reeve was nowhere to be found. She was alone. But she wasn't broken. That night, she backed up her files to a hidden transmitter disguised as an old field radio. The evidence had to be preserved. If not to stop this raid, then to expose the chain of operations that enabled it. The next morning, the convoy rolled out. Elira, reassigned to vehicle maintenance for the mission, rode in the second truck, close enough to monitor movements, far enough from the command lead to avoid direct scrutiny. The road to the village wound through dense woods and narrow paths, and as they approached the final stretch, a mine detonated under the lead vehicle. Chaos erupted. Smoke, shouts, gunfire. It wasn't a resistance ambush. It was too precise, too timed. Someone had planted the device to send a message. In the chaos, Elira seized the moment. She located a comm station unattended and sent a scrambled transmission through a rarely used frequency. Her backup, prepared weeks in advance. It contained her full report, photos, data logs, timestamps. The transmission only took 42 seconds. She didn't know if it reached anyone. But she knew she had to act like it never happened. In the aftermath, the raid was postponed pending investigation. Officially, it was because of the IED threat. Unofficially, whispers began to circulate about a mole, about tampered intelligence, about a soldier who refused to salute not out of disrespect, but because she saw something others chose to ignore. Elira didn't relax. She knew retaliation might come, but for now, the village was safe. And she still had one last card to play. The transmission she'd sent hadn't just gone to one recipient, it had gone to several, including one that would soon make the story public. Elira knew the war was far from over, but her refusal had already changed its course, and the truth was finally moving, even if in shadows. Era awoke before dawn the next day, her limbs heavy with the burden of everything she had witnessed and the decisions she had made. The camp outside the city was still cloaked in early morning fog, a strange stillness in the air, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. She sat on the edge of her cot, boots beside her, staring into the fabric of the tent, with the weight of the previous night pressing down like a storm cloud. The intercepted orders from Commander Strathern had not left her mind. If anything, they were seared into her brain, etched with the same intensity as the screams she imagined would echo across Sunder Hollow if no one intervened. She had spent the entire night debating her next move, knowing that confronting the chain of command would be more than just a matter of protocol. It could be a matter of life and death. By sunrise, she had made her decision, not because she wanted to be a hero, but because the thought of innocent civilians being treated as insurgents, of entire families being wiped out under the pretense of cleansing, was something she could not live with if she remained silent. She stood, dressed swiftly, and secured the documents within the inner lining of her jacket. Her face, once radiant with youth and determination, now bore the expression of someone aged by consequence. She walked to the command tent with measured steps, each one fueled by conviction and dread. Inside, Colonel Venn awaited her, already briefed on her request for an urgent morning report. He looked up from a stack of maps and notes, his sharp eyes narrowing as she entered. Ira handed over the sealed envelope. No words, just her eyes meeting his, imploring him to read what lay inside before dismissing her. As he opened it and scanned the contents, she saw the change in his posture. His spine straightened, his jaw clenched. Silence filled the tent like a brewing thunderstorm. When he finally looked up, there was disbelief in his voice, the kind of disbelief that knew the danger of what she had handed him. He questioned the validity. She confirmed it. She told him exactly how the orders were obtained, who had drafted them, and what they meant. The pretense of a cleanup operation in Sunder Hollow was nothing more than a front for a massacre. Ira had never spoken so firmly, so clearly, her voice stripped of rank or emotion. Only truth remained. Colonel Venn, a seasoned officer who had seen his share of battlefield politics, didn't react with immediate dismissal. He didn't accuse her of treason, at least not yet. Instead, he stared at the map behind her, deep in thought. He ordered her to remain in her quarters for the rest of the day. She would not be detained, but she was not to leave without orders. That instruction alone told her something important. He was not ignoring the report. He was verifying it. For the next 18 hours, Era sat on the edge of her cot, her ears alert to every movement beyond the canvas walls. She could hear boots thudding past, voices murmuring, the constant rumble of strategy and doubt shifting within the walls of command. When night fell again, she lay awake, hands gripping the sides of the cot, her heart pounding with fear not for herself, but for Sundar Hollow. Had she done enough? Would Ven act? Or would her act of bravery be buried under red tape and military loyalty? The next morning, the answer came, not in words, but in motion. Troops that were supposed to mobilize toward Sundar Hollow were redirected. Supplies were reassigned. A revised mission briefing was circulated through hushed conversations. Ira was called back into Colonel Ven's tent. This time he didn't greet her with skepticism. He nodded at her as if to say, "You were right, and now we carry that weight." He confirmed that he had passed the intelligence to Central Command, and after cross-checking encrypted communications, the decision had been made to suspend Operation Emberfield indefinitely pending investigation. The Sundar Hollow civilians would not be touched. The unit assigned to the operation would be redeployed to logistics and aid missions, far from any aggressive engagement. Commander Strathen, meanwhile, was summoned to a secure facility for questioning. The implications were massive. A high-ranking official had drafted and nearly executed an unauthorized strike. Whispers of tribunal proceedings began circulating. Ira, still processing the implications, asked what would happen to her. Colonel Ven looked at her not with judgment, but with something that resembled admiration, albeit guarded. He said, "There are rules, and then there is justice. You honored both." He warned her that she would be watched, but he would ensure she wouldn't be punished for doing the right thing. Not officially. The unofficial consequences, however, would be another story. From that moment on, Ira felt the atmosphere around her shift. Fellow soldiers became distant. Some looked at her with suspicion, others with quiet respect, but few said anything at all. She had become something of a ghost in her own unit, present, but untouched, unreachable. Her name began to circulate beyond the base. Within military circles, she became known as the one who stopped Emberfield. Her act referenced in whispers at academies, discussed in ethics briefings, even invoked in debates about chain of command accountability. But within herself, Era didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who simply refused to look away. Someone who had chosen to act, not knowing if it would matter, but unwilling to be silent. Sundar Hollow remained intact. Its people never knew how close they had come to destruction, and perhaps that was the greatest reward. They didn't have to know, they just had to live. For the first time in days, Leora found herself alone in the quiet corner of the medical tent, her hands still stained from the work she'd done on wounded villagers, her mind echoing with the screams she could not silence. The pace of her days had grown more frantic since the orders had arrived, more bodies flowing through the encampment like a grim tide. Men, women, and even children bore the marks of something far beyond the stated purpose of the occupation. What had once been explained as, quote, territorial stabilization was unraveling into systematic violence, and she was no longer sure if she could separate herself from it. As the evening shadows stretched long over the camp and the smell of gun oil and cooked rations clung to the air, Leora finally read the sealed directive that had been slipped under her cot the night before, a covert communique she had tucked away until she could breathe. The wax seal had borne no insignia, which immediately told her it was not from the command office, but from the informal network of field officers who whispered concerns over cigarettes in the dark. She read slowly, her eyes scanning each sentence twice. It confirmed what she feared and more. General Ruskov had not only fast-tracked the village cleansing operations, but he had authorized the detention of anyone refusing to vacate. That would include the sick, the old, and the very families she had been treating. Worse still, the report indicated that within 72 hours, a containment perimeter was to be established. Military jargon for fencing in an entire population like livestock under the guise of preventing insurgent re-entry. But the document didn't just reveal the strategy, it listed the psychological framework being used, techniques to dehumanize the local population, to ensure soldiers felt less remorse. Phrases like necessary deconstruction of emotional resistance and controlled narrative deployment turned her stomach. It wasn't just war, it was indoctrinated cruelty, dressed in uniform and sanctioned by flags. Leora's mind drifted back to an encounter from just 2 nights ago. A young soldier named Timo, barely 19, had come into the tent with a deep cut across his forearm and a tremble in his hands he couldn't hide. She had stitched him up, but more importantly, she had listened when he whispered about what he'd seen: a squad forcing a family out at gunpoint, the mother screaming for her infant left inside a burning hut. He hadn't participated, but he hadn't stopped it either. "I'm not sure who we are anymore," he had murmured before thanking her for the bandages. Leora had no answer then, but now she knew what must be done. She couldn't walk away. She couldn't look away. If she couldn't stop the machine from turning, she had to throw something into its gears. The following morning, as the camp moved like clockwork under the tight regime of Raskov's rule, Leora began laying the groundwork. She returned to her tent and piece by piece removed the maps she had been quietly annotating. On each, she had marked roads, exits, communication nodes, and resource lines. Not for retreat or rebellion, but for exposure. She intended to leak these not to enemies, but to international watchdog groups through a neutral diplomatic channel. If she could make it appear as a routine supply report, routed through a civilian aid convoy, perhaps the truth could reach someone with power before the perimeter was sealed. Her hands shook only slightly as she compiled the files, stashing them within a medical crate, scheduled to be picked up by the Red Cross in 2 days. That night she approached Timo again, but this time, not as a medic. She showed him a snapshot of the directive, careful not to give him the full document. She asked him questions, posed hypotheticals. Would he protect a child if ordered to leave them behind? Would he speak up if he knew innocent people were about to be harmed under a false directive? His eyes burned with the weight of decisions too large for someone so young, but in the end he nodded. "If you need someone to do the right thing, I'll try." It wasn't a commitment, but it was hope. From that moment, Leora expanded her quiet recruitment. A transport officer named Mira, who had once smuggled antibiotics past a checkpoint for a dying elder. A field cook named Haru, who snuck meals to displaced villagers outside the zone. Even a translator, Amin, who despite being under military payroll, had relatives in the zones marked for containment. They became her thread network, each person unaware of the whole, but each responsible for one piece of the unraveling plan. Leora knew the risk. The wrong whisper could expose everything, but she no longer feared for herself. The only fear that truly haunted her now was doing nothing. By day, she carried on with her duties, checking vitals, cleaning wounds, and pretending the uniform still meant healing. But by night, she drafted messages in code, constructed exit scenarios, and calculated what evidence would be needed to cause a diplomatic stir large enough to stall the operation. Her aim wasn't to defect, it wasn't even to accuse, it was to delay. If she could slow the wheels of the command just long enough, international monitors might arrive. Or media, or even rival officers from the capital, with enough sway to audit Raskov's rule. She didn't need a miracle, just time. But time was not her ally. On the morning of the second day, an emergency meeting was called. General Raskov had returned from an inspection in a nearby region early, and his mood was far from calm. Rumors circulated that a drone had caught footage of unauthorized civilian gatherings near the medical tent. Leora's heart sank. If any of her movements had been noticed, any crate tagged strangely, any conversation overheard, it could all come crumbling down before the final piece was set. She tucked away her notes, fastened her jacket, and walked into the open with her chin high. No fear now, just resolve. The wind carried the faint scent of gunpowder and rain across the highlands as Isla rode through the narrow mountain pass, flanked by 2 scouts and a mule hauling water. Her eyes were fixed ahead, but her thoughts drifted back to the hidden ledger she had smuggled out of Colonel Stahl's quarters. It was now tucked safely inside the inner lining of her coat, A dangerous choice, but one she knew was necessary. The pages were filled with locations, dates, orders, details that painted a picture darker than anyone in the camp wanted to believe. She knew now that the village they were being sent to cleanse wasn't harboring insurgents at all. It was a trap of a different kind. A trap for conscience, morality, and the last threads of humanity still hanging by a thread in this war. The documents proved that the intelligence had been fabricated. The orders weren't based on any real threat, but were part of a broader campaign to instill fear and obedience by targeting strategically irrelevant, yet symbolically defiant communities. Ahead of her, the peaks of Ostra rose like jagged teeth from the earth, ancient and unforgiving. At the base of those mountains lay the village of Aravik, the next target. Isla had heard the rumors whispered around campfires and in mess halls. Aravik was known for its refusal to bow to any outside control. They had resisted the regime not with weapons but with silence. They refused to register their children, they grew their own food, and they never answered when soldiers came knocking. For the regime, their very existence was an insult. For Colonel Stahl, it was an opportunity to crush rebellion through spectacle. Isla's hands tightened around the reins as the first rooftops came into view in the valley below. Smoke curled gently from chimneys, unaware of the storm approaching. The unit encamped just outside Aravik by dusk, and tents were erected with practiced speed. Isla requested command to survey the outer perimeter of the village before nightfall, citing tactical preparation. Stahl granted it without suspicion. As she walked alone through the narrow paths between the stone houses, she saw no soldiers, no guards, no weapons. Just families quietly preparing for evening, some praying, some singing lullabies to children. It felt untouched, almost sacred, in its simplicity. But the simplicity was deceptive. Isla knew that come morning, this village would be marked for destruction, unless she did something. When she returned to the camp, the final briefing was already underway. Stahl's voice was cold and mechanical as he outlined their formation. Units A and B would sweep in from the east, C and D would enter through the fields in the south. The goal: detain every adult male, search and seize any resistance materials, and then, if deemed necessary, initiate a full village relocation. Isla's chest burned with quiet fury. She raised her hand to ask one question. If resistance was not found, what would be the protocol? Stahl didn't blink as he answered. The village had already been labeled non-compliant. Their destruction had been authorized days ago. The silence that followed hung like a curse. Isla didn't sleep that night. She paced near the munitions tent, her mind racing through options. She had the documents. She had seen the people. She had heard Stahl's chilling words. But what could she do that wouldn't just get her executed on the spot? Then it came to her. A whisper of an idea, reckless and desperate. The following morning, before the unit mobilized, Isla approached Commander Stahl directly in front of the entire assembled regiment. The sky was overcast, clouds pressing low. Soldiers tightened straps, loaded rifles, adjusted helmets. Isla stood at full attention, boots planted firmly in the muddy earth, eyes straight ahead. Stahl strode out, arms behind his back, pausing in front of Isla as protocol dictated. And then it happened. She refused to salute, no hand to brow, no nod of respect. Just silence. The camp fell into a collective hush, as if the air had been sucked out of the world. Stahl stopped, stunned. The moment stretched painfully. When he demanded an explanation, Isla didn't falter. In a calm, steady voice that carried over the gathered soldiers, she declared that she had evidence the mission was unlawful, that the village was innocent, and that the destruction of Aravik would constitute a war crime. Gasps rippled through the ranks. Eyes widened. Stahl's face contorted with rage. He ordered her detained immediately. But Isla had planned for this. Just before stepping forward, she had entrusted a sealed envelope containing the copied documents to Private Malak, a quiet logistics officer who had lost a brother in a similar operation months earlier. Malik was instructed to deliver it to the High Ethics Tribunal via an encrypted channel if she didn't return by nightfall. As Isla was dragged away by guards, she shouted to the rest of the unit, "Do not obey unlawful orders. Remember Aravik, remember your oath." Her voice echoed against the cliffs. Some soldiers looked away, but others stared at her with something new in their eyes: doubt, reflection, maybe even courage. As she was locked inside the transport vehicle, Isla allowed herself a single breath of relief. Not because she thought she would survive what was coming, but because she had lit the fuse, and that, she knew, was sometimes all it took. The village of Darska had become a crucible of human endurance, where hope flickered faintly like candlelight in a storm. Lena walked through its narrow alleys, her boots crunching the frost-bitten ground, each step a silent vow to uphold what was right in a world that no longer made sense. The silence of the place unsettled her more than any firefight could. Buildings stood half-toppled, some reduced to smoldering shells, others eerily intact, but with windows gaping like haunted eyes. The townspeople, what was left of them, had retreated into their homes like ghosts, afraid to be seen, afraid to hope, afraid to speak. Lena didn't blame them. The mere presence of the Red Crest Division had instilled a terror that words could not touch. Their reputation for brutal enforcement preceded them, and now that their new orders had come down from Commander Ryal, the town's future was hanging by a thread. What disturbed her most wasn't the silence, though. It was the anticipation. Something was about to happen. Something irreversible. Lena had been summoned to the command post at dawn. A folded message had been slipped under her cot during the night, bearing no signature, only a red wax seal, an unmistakable symbol of a covert directive. When she opened it, the contents chilled her to her marrow. Operation Emberfall, a full razing of Darska, scheduled in 72 hours. The justification, as vague as it was cruel, cited non-compliance with central authority and harboring resistance informants. She had read the words over and over, trying to decipher the layers beneath them. This wasn't justice. It wasn't strategy. It was extermination disguised as policy. Lena had spent the next several hours in sleepless pacing, knowing what she had to do but weighed down by what it would cost. Her refusal to salute Real had opened the first crack. This would widen it into a chasm. Her first move was to reach out to a contact she had never thought she'd call Yurik, a former intelligence analyst who'd vanished from active duty months ago after blowing the whistle on black site activities by their own commanders. He was presumed dead or exiled, but Lena knew better. He'd simply gone underground. Through a coded message embedded in a supply requisition, Lena called for a meet in the ruins of an old vineyard a few kilometers beyond the village. She didn't know if he'd come. She didn't know if the message even reached him, but if it did, he was her only chance. While waiting, Lena began building a quiet alliance inside the camp. She didn't need many, just a few who still believed in the original oath they took, the one that spoke of protection, not punishment. She found an unlikely ally in Corporal Nasrin, a medic who had tended to the aftermaths of too many unnecessary strikes. Nasrin didn't speak often, but her eyes were always watching, calculating, absorbing. When Lena laid out what she had read in the sealed orders, Nasrin's response was simple, a slow nod, and the words, "Then we stop it." Meanwhile, Commander Riel continued his strategic theater, inspecting troops, hosting hollow briefings, and issuing cryptic orders that made it clear he expected no resistance. He carried himself like a man above reproach, armored by arrogance and surrounded by yes-men who feared stepping out of line. Lena had watched the man bark commands with false righteousness, each word cloaked in patriotic rhetoric. But it wasn't just his words that frightened her. It was the way others echoed them back, like an infectious belief spreading through those desperate for order, even at the cost of their humanity. 2 nights later, under the veil of darkness, Lena crept out toward the vineyard ruins. It was colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made you question every choice you'd ever made. She crouched behind a crumbled stone wall, listening for anything: footsteps, breath, betrayal. But what she heard instead was a soft cough and then the unmistakable click of a flashlight. There he was, Yurik, thinner than she remembered, eyes haunted but alert. He said nothing at first, simply handed her a folder sealed in black. Inside were intercepted communications, proof that Operation Emberfall had nothing to do with insurgents and everything to do with a land dispute between private military contractors and the villagers of Darska, who refused to surrender their farmland. It was all orchestrated, sanctioned by a shadow board of corporate interests posing as defense strategists. Yurik had traced the directive up the chain, past Real, past the generals, all the way to the ministerial office itself. Lena felt sick, not with surprise, but with the weight of confirmation. This wasn't war, it was business, and Darska was collateral. They had 2 days left. Huglad. She and Nazrin worked in tandem, slipping the contents of the folder to select individuals: officers who had seen too much and said too little, engineers who could stall artillery deployments, signal techs who could reroute commands. With every hour, the cracks in Real's operation widened, yet Lena knew that sabotage alone wouldn't stop Emberfall. They needed exposure. They needed the world to see it before it happened. Yurik provided the channel, a dormant satellite link hidden in the comms center, left unused since the last armistice, but still functional if you had the right clearance codes. That night, while the camp dozed in uneasy silence, Lena initiated the broadcast. Her voice trembled as she spoke into the recorder, detailing the entire plot, reading the orders aloud, showing the forged evidence of insurgency. She didn't show her face. It wasn't about her, it was about truth. Nazrin uploaded the files, bypassing firewalls while Yurik manipulated the transmission path. The video was sent directly to international monitors, whistleblower forums, and even a few sympathetic journalists in the capital. It was only a matter of time before it caught fire. But now, the countdown had begun. The Red Crest Division was still preparing to execute Emberfall. The final act was coming, and Lena knew there was no turning back. The question wasn't whether they would be punished. It was whether they could delay long enough for the world to react. And for the first time in weeks, Lena didn't feel afraid. She felt ready. The silence that followed the halted ceremony at the Eastern Ridge outpost stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Commander Brandt had left without a word after Talia's revelation, but no one knew what consequences were being stirred behind the closed doors of the operations bunker. Rumors swirled around the camp like smoke from the mess hall. Some said Brandt was filing immediate charges of treason. Others whispered that the intelligence Talia had presented was being quietly verified. But Talia herself remained calm. In the days that followed, she kept her routine without deviation, showing up for drills, reporting for watch rotations, and submitting after-action reports as though nothing had happened. There was a quiet determination in her every movement, a sense of unwavering clarity that made her more untouchable than ever, even to those who had once laughed behind her back. One evening, 2 days after the incident, a black, unmarked vehicle rolled into the camp just after sunset. From it stepped General Halverson, a high-ranking officer from Central Command, accompanied by 2 intelligence officers. The atmosphere across the camp changed instantly. Soldiers stiffened in posture. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. No one knew if this was the beginning of Talia's arrest or something far worse. That night, instead of hauling her away, General Halverson requested a private meeting with her. It lasted 4 hours. By morning, the general left with no public statements, but several sealed folders, including the original dossier Talia had presented to Commander Brandt. When asked by her squad what had been discussed, Talia only replied that the general had listened. The next morning, Commander Brandt stood before the full battalion and issued a brief but stunning announcement. Operation Cold Mantle was to be indefinitely suspended pending formal review. All cross-border engagements were canceled. Effective immediately, all units would revert to defensive postures only. No explanation followed. No questions were allowed. And Brandt didn't mention Talia's name once. But the implications were clear to everyone. She had been right. That evening, Sergeant Calhoun approached her, not with the sarcasm he usually wore like armor, but with something resembling respect. He handed her a folded piece of paper, an anonymous thank you note written in uneven handwriting. It simply read, "You made sure we didn't become monsters." After that, more notes started to appear, folded scraps left on her bunk, slipped into her locker, even an old, dirt-smudged sketch of a child's face with the words, "My brother thanks you," written beneath it. The same men and women who had once mocked her for her restraint, her patience, her almost religious commitment to morality, were now beginning to understand the strength it took to stand still while the world screamed for action. But even as some soldiers offered their quiet gratitude, others remained bitter. Commander Brandt, stripped of operational control, was reassigned to a desk job at Central Command Headquarters in the capital. He left without ceremony, without saying goodbye to the unit he once commanded with iron resolve. Rumor had it that he'd fought hard to defend the original operation until Central Intelligence confirmed Talia's findings through independent sources. Among the many pieces of evidence, the most damning were intercepted communiques between General Rostan and militia leaders, chillingly detailed plans to use the refugee movement as cover to commit widespread ethnic cleansing across the lowland provinces. Had the operation gone through as planned, the unit would have unknowingly opened a corridor directly into the trap, enabling Rostan's forces to justify mass retaliation under a veil of legitimacy. And with international observers unaware of the subterfuge, those deaths would have been counted as unfortunate collateral rather than calculated extermination. Talia had not only prevented her unit from becoming unwilling pawns in a war crime, she had disrupted an entire chain of atrocities before they could begin. The story didn't stay buried for long. 6 weeks later, a whistleblower report was leaked to several major international networks. Though heavily redacted, it detailed how a lone lieutenant in a remote outpost had halted a military operation that would have led to the deaths of thousands. Her name was never mentioned in the official papers, but within military circles, everyone knew who it was. That kind of recognition didn't make life easier for Talia. In fact, it brought new scrutiny. Some accused her of disloyalty. Others called her a hero. But through it all, she remained quiet, never once giving an interview or claiming credit. She returned to her duties, transferred shortly after to a peacekeeping division that handled post-conflict negotiations in neighboring territories. It was there, working alongside civilian leaders and humanitarian experts, that she felt she was finally where she belonged, not just preventing war but healing its aftermath. Occasionally, young recruits would approach her, nervously introducing themselves and asking about the story. She always responded the same way. She didn't stop a war, she just asked the right question at the right time and didn't back down when the answer wasn't convenient. In the broader landscape of military history, her act would not appear in textbooks. No medals were awarded, no statues raised. But in the villages that would have been wiped off the map, families continued to live, generations growing up, never knowing how close they came to extinction. And in the quiet corners of the world, where decisions are made not with guns but with truth, Talia's name was spoken with reverence by those who understood that sometimes the most heroic thing a soldier can do is simply say no. In the days that followed the commander's arrest, word of the incident spread beyond the confines of Camp Leisgard. Other military outposts began murmuring about Lieutenant Isla Merin, the woman who had refused to salute a commanding officer and, by doing so, unveiled a string of criminal atrocities that would have otherwise remained buried. Her name, once whispered in suspicion and criticism, began to echo in tones of reverence and admiration. But for Alina, the transformation in public perception meant little. She had not acted out of a desire for recognition or heroism. Her thoughts still lingered on the faces of the villagers from Varnhold, the ones she had met, and the ones who hadn't survived. She could still hear the haunting silence of their burnt homes and the cries of their children as they were forced from their beds by armored men. The emotional weight of those images didn't leave her, not in sleep, not even in the rare moments of quiet during the day. Yet even as she carried that burden, She pressed forward. After the tribunal ruled in her favor and formally charged Commander Isla with multiple counts of war crimes, she was offered the opportunity to transfer out of her unit. The brass believed it was safer and more tactically sound to move her somewhere less volatile while the military system adjusted to the shockwaves she had created. But Isla refused. She had begun to see her place not as a mere follower of commands, but as a custodian of ethics, someone who, even if low in rank, could ensure that the mission of the armed forces remained grounded in decency and humanity. Her refusal to transfer was her second act of quiet defiance. Some around her applauded the courage. Others worried she was inviting retaliation, even from those outside the reach of the tribunal. Still, she remained, determined that her presence would serve as both a deterrent and a reminder to anyone else tempted to use their power recklessly. One afternoon, as she completed training drills with her platoon, a vehicle arrived at the base carrying members of the International Military Ethics Commission. They were conducting a series of interviews gathering evidence for a broader investigation now spanning multiple countries. Commander Isla's arrest had opened a vault of secrets that others were now forced to confront. They asked for Isla personally. For hours, she gave testimony, not just of that fateful morning, but of all the subtle warning signs she'd noticed before. The shifts in orders, the evasion of oversight, the vague mission directives that were never fully explained. She provided dates, names, maps, even conversations she'd quietly recorded in her personal logs. Her documentation, combined with that of Dr. Rivanos, helped uncover a network of covert operations intended to destabilize non-compliant regions under the guise of anti-terrorism. When she finished speaking, one of the commissioners stood and said, "You may have saved thousands." The words should have comforted her. Instead, they only intensified the pressure she felt in her chest. The price of those saved lives still included dozens who hadn't made it. The weight of that couldn't be softened by recognition. Still, she nodded and thanked them. It was never about saving the world. It was about not standing still when something was clearly wrong. Meanwhile, within her unit, things slowly began to shift. The soldiers who once avoided her now occasionally asked for her opinion. Her superiors, initially cold, began involving her in planning briefings and tactical reviews. It wasn't a sweeping change, more like ice slowly melting. But even small transformations felt monumental. One day, during a particularly long-range reconnaissance assignment, she was paired with Captain Eirik Vens, a seasoned soldier known for his skepticism of both bureaucracy and rebellion. For the first few hours, they said little beyond what protocol required, but as they camped under the stars on their second night, he finally broke the silence. "I thought you were reckless," he said, cleaning his weapon by firelight. "But now I think maybe you were the only one actually doing your job right." Isla didn't respond at first. Then she said, "I didn't plan it. I just couldn't be silent." Eirik nodded. "It takes more guts to stand alone than to charge into fire with a unit behind you. Just so you know, we've got your back now." It wasn't a declaration of unconditional support, but it was enough. That night she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks, an ember of belonging. The months that followed were marked by trial proceedings in international courts. Commander Isla was extradited and convicted, receiving a sentence that ensured he would never again wear a uniform. Several others implicated in the operation were also brought to justice, though some slipped through political cracks. The military command issued new oversight protocols and restructured the internal chain of accountability. None of it undid what had happened, but it was a start. Back at Camp Leisgard, Isla continued her service. She worked closely with Dr. Rivanos and Captain Vens to train younger officers on ethics in combat, leading workshops on the moral dimensions of following orders. Soldiers were encouraged not just to obey, but to understand the implications of what they were being asked to do. In those sessions, Isla often quoted something her grandmother had told her as a child: "Sometimes the strongest hearts are the ones that dare to break rank." That phrase, which had once sounded like rebellion, now carried a deeper sense of duty. And in every new recruit who asked a hard question or hesitated before a blind command, she saw a future stronger than the past they had inherited. The weight of Zofia's decision pulsed through the camp like a drumbeat, invisible yet relentless, drawing attention not by its noise, but by the uncomfortable silence that followed. Word had spread, as it always did in tightly wound military installations, that she had once again defied protocol, not out of arrogance or rebellion, but through a measured, silent force of conscience. Captain Beringer, though absent during the incident, had been informed by his adjutant within minutes. By nightfall, the commander's tent was no longer just a place of strategy and command. It was a war room of pride, shame, politics, and consequences. Zofia sat alone on her bunk, a mixture of dread and clarity rising within her like tidewater. She understood the price of defiance, especially at a time when military unity was being paraded as the highest virtue. Yet, what she saw in the commander's eyes that morning, the eagerness for dominance, the cold detachment from humanity, it was more dangerous than enemy fire. It mirrored what she had once read in the diaries of war criminals during her university thesis, where the descent into moral rot was paved with small permissions and unquestioned commands. As dusk swallowed the last hints of sun behind the mountain ridge, a figure approached her tent. It was Lieutenant Elgin, a quiet man with a reputation for listening more than speaking. He entered, pulling the flap closed behind him without a word. When he finally met her eyes, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the gravity of a man who knew what had been set in motion. He didn't speak of the salute or the commander. Instead, he asked her what she saw in the village that day. Zofia, still raw with the weight of it all, described the children behind the ox cart, the old man clutching a Bible to his chest, and the eerie stillness that had followed when the soldiers were told to search the homes for hidden threats. She shared how the commander had ordered weapons to be planted in the barns for staged discovery, a deception to justify mass displacement. Elgin remained quiet for a long time after she finished. When he finally left, he carried not just the weight of her words, but the spark of a decision that would shape the days to come. The next morning, the base was teeming with an energy that felt unnatural. Trucks rumbled across the dirt roads like insects disturbed from a nest, and junior officers barked commands with an urgency that betrayed nerves more than confidence. In the command tent, Captain Beringer faced Commander Rausch in a heated but composed conversation. Zofia wasn't present, but she could sense her name being passed between them like a live grenade. By midday, she was summoned, not for reprimand, but to report directly to the regional headquarters 2 provinces east. It was an abrupt reassignment, under the guise of retraining and moral recalibration, a term so sterile it reeked of political cover. But as she packed her few belongings, her heart was not heavy. Something in Elgin's expression the night before told her this wasn't exile, it was protection. When she arrived at Regional HQ, she found herself surrounded not by punishers, but by quiet observers. Lawyers, advisors, ethics officers, all of them part of an internal military watchdog unit she'd only heard rumors about. Apparently, Elgin had reported her statement directly to Colonel Riedel, the head of the Internal Review Board, bypassing the chain of command entirely. The colonel had been monitoring Rausch's growing aggression and manipulation of field data for some time, but lacked a direct witness brave enough to speak. Now, with Zofia's account corroborated by a few classified field recordings, the pieces of a larger investigation were finally falling into place. Meanwhile, back at the camp, the operation on the village was suspended indefinitely. Commander Rausch, furious and humiliated, accused his officers of insubordination and moral rot, but his words now sounded hollow. Several members of the platoon had begun submitting anonymous reports echoing Zofia's testimony, emboldened by her stance. Lieutenant Elgin, once silent in his observation, had become an unexpected axis of quiet resistance, gathering testimonials and forwarding them discreetly to the internal tribunal. The soldiers, many of them young and uncertain, started to question the orders they were given, not in the spirit of rebellion, but of responsibility. A culture of silence was starting to crack. Zofia, meanwhile, spent her days under observation, not in a punitive sense, but in review and debrief. She answered questions for hours, signed documents she didn't fully understand, and spoke to men and women who had seen far worse unravel due to silence and complicity. One particularly intense interview involved a psychologist named Dr. Kelm, who pressed her not about the events, but about her personal philosophy. Zofia, weary yet firm, explained that history had already shown what happened when obedience was worshipped over integrity. Her own grandmother had fled East Prussia during the war, and her tales were woven with the fear of authority gone unchecked. The salute, Zofia said, is not just a gesture. It's an agreement. And I couldn't agree with what he was doing. Dr. Kelm didn't respond. He simply nodded and ended the session early. As days turned into weeks, Zofia's reassignment was eventually lifted, but she didn't return to her old unit. Instead, she was offered a new post, one that operated under the radar, a training and ethics liaison for field commanders, specifically designed to prevent abuse of power in high-tension deployments. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her refusal to salute had branded her insubordinate in one world, but a leader in another. Her days were now filled with lectures, simulations, and role-play scenarios designed to teach officers that morality wasn't weakness, but strength. She didn't always feel brave, and she didn't think of herself as a hero, but she knew this was the work that mattered. And far from her, in a quiet village at the edge of a contested province, families continued their simple lives, planting crops, drawing water, laughing with their children, unaware of how close they had come to ruin. They didn't know Zofia's name, and perhaps they never would. But the absence of war is sometimes the greatest monument to courage. Lena sat on the edge of her cot that night, her thoughts looping in unrelenting circles. The wind outside scraped at the old wooden walls of the cabin like fingers searching for an opening, and her candle had long since burned out. She stared into the dark, trying to understand the depth of the storm she had stirred. Outside, there was silence, but it was not the peaceful kind. It was the silence of men holding their breath, waiting for orders, waiting for action, waiting for the first sound to trigger the chaos they'd trained for. General Radek had been locked in his quarters for hours, poring over intelligence files and strategy maps that had been rewritten more times than anyone could count. Since the confrontation on the parade grounds, word had spread across the camp like wildfire. Lena's refusal to salute had been interpreted by some as bravery, by others as foolishness, and by a few as outright rebellion. But no one could deny the ripple effect it had created. The decision to delay the operation had bought them time enough, Lena hoped, for the truth to claw its way to the surface. Earlier that day, Commander Mirko had returned from the capital with hastily drawn-up documents authorizing a, quote, preemptive strike. The mission was to proceed within 72 hours, but Radek remained unconvinced. He had summoned Lena privately, not with fury this time, but with an almost clinical curiosity. He had laid the documents on his desk, tapping the seal with his index finger, and asked her, simply, why? Lena had expected to be screamed at, demoted, or imprisoned. She had not expected to be listened to. So she told him everything, not just about the intelligence inconsistencies or the drone footage anomalies, but about her unease, her gut sense that something was being orchestrated to provoke them into a war that wasn't theirs. She spoke of the intercepted messages in a dialect too precise to be the enemy's, of the refugees whose stories hinted at manufactured conflicts. She told him about the children, always the children, who seemed to disappear right before major offensives, never to be accounted for again. Radek hadn't interrupted her. When she finished, he said nothing. He merely waved her out and remained alone in the tent long after nightfall. Now Lena listened to the stillness, wondering whether her words had mattered at all. She had never known Radek to be a sentimental man, nor one easily swayed. But he was pragmatic, and pragmatism, she knew, sometimes demanded uncomfortable truths. The following morning, as the sun tore through the fog with burning orange rays, a summons arrived. The general wanted to see her, immediately. She entered the operations tent with heavy steps, her uniform still dusted with dried mud and her eyes hollow from sleeplessness. The room was unusually full. Officers, aides, and strategists crowded around the map table, but it was silent when she arrived. Radek stood with his back to her, one hand resting on the map and the other holding a small black folder. Without turning, he began to speak. He told them that he had cross-checked Lena's concerns with a classified network used only by High Command. He confirmed that the images from the drone had been doctored, and the heat signatures faked. The village scheduled for bombardment was not a weapons depot. It was a refugee encampment, unarmed, vulnerable, and hiding from multiple factions. Gasps filled the room, but no one interrupted him. He turned slowly to face them, his face stern but not angry. He said that Lena's refusal had violated protocol, but that, had it not happened, they would be complicit in a massacre. He paused, eyes scanning the room. Then he spoke the words that would define the next chapter of their mission. From this moment forward, we will not move without absolute confirmation of target identity. Our war is not with the innocent. If we become the monsters we claim to fight, then we've already lost. The air in the room changed. It was no longer charged with suspicion or judgment. It was heavy with relief, with shame, and with something Lena had not expected: respect. The officers looked at her, not as a traitor, but as the reason they had not become murderers. That day, an investigative task force was created. Lena was placed at its helm. Her mission was clear: audit every target, question every piece of intelligence, and ensure no further atrocities would be carried out in the name of misdirection. For the first time in her career, she wasn't simply following orders. She was shaping them. But even as she stood among the ranks of a reformed unit, Lena couldn't shake the images burned into her memory: the mother with the red scarf, the child with the bruised cheek, the collapsing homes she had seen from the drone footage. The truth had saved hundreds, but how many had already been lost to the lies, and what forces were still manipulating them from behind veils of bureaucracy and distance? As she walked past the training fields later that afternoon, she noticed the cadets had resumed drills. When they passed General Radek, each snapped a sharp salute. Lena nodded at them in passing, but none expected her to return the gesture. The salute wasn't a demand anymore. It was a choice. One she had made not with her hand but with her conscience. And for now, that was enough. The wind over the plateau roared like an omen as Lena stood still in the open field, her boots planted firmly in the same soil where so many had fallen. The sun had long dipped behind the western cliffs, casting the world in violet hues, but she barely noticed the beauty of the twilight. All she could hear was the commander's voice echoing from hours earlier, that brutal rasp demanding loyalty, obedience, silence. His words haunted her even now, curling in the back of her mind like smoke that would not clear. She had not saluted him. She had made her stand, and in that moment, the entire machinery of command had nearly crushed her. But something had shifted. What had been an unthinkable act, a soldier refusing the most basic symbol of deference, had forced a chain of reckonings that rippled through every echelon of command. The tension had reached its peak when Colonel Drexler stormed into the tribunal chambers with new orders from the High Command, his face ashen and lips pursed. Lena remembered the look in his eyes. It was not anger. It was not betrayal. It was fear. Raw, undeniable fear. Not of her, but of what had almost happened under their watch. It turned out that her refusal had coincided with a sealed report that had just reached Central Command. Intelligence had intercepted a series of unauthorized communications between Commander Cernik and an off-the-books division known as Red Echo. Their supposed mission? To stabilize several villages accused of harboring dissenters. The methods? Total erasure. The plan had been set in motion under the guise of classified deployment protocols, shielded by bureaucratic jargon, and buried under layers of encrypted logistics. But one low-ranking communications analyst had noticed something strange: deployment codes that didn't match any active authorization trees. And that analyst, an intern named Raphael Moritz, had raised the flag just as Lena was being marched into the tribunal hall. It was a coincidence of timing that saved hundreds, perhaps thousands. But in the minds of many, it was Lena's refusal that cracked the facade of silence and forced eyes where they didn't want to look. She had spoken the unspoken. She had held a mirror to the system. After the tribunal was adjourned and the room had emptied, Lena remained seated for a long time, her eyes focused not on the ornate seal of the Republic above the dais, but on the floor, where a single hairline crack stretched across the polished marble. It was the kind of imperfection most would overlook, but she couldn't. It reminded her of how thin the line truly was between discipline and destruction, between order and atrocity. That night, they did not place her in a cell. Instead, she was moved to a secured observation barracks, monitored, yes, but not imprisoned. The charges against her were suspended, pending further investigation. That phrase echoed in every official document, in every whispered conversation. It was neither exoneration nor condemnation. It was stasis. And yet, she could feel the balance tilting. What she didn't know yet was that Captain Elior had been working in the background, gathering testimonies from fellow officers and soldiers who had long harbored doubts about Cernic's conduct, but were too afraid to speak. Lena's act had given them a kind of shield, a precedent. One by one, they came forward, not in dramatic protests, but in quiet, detailed reports. Logistics officers noting unusual requests, medical staff reporting untraceable injuries on civilians, surveillance techs observing patterns of deleted footage. None of it had been enough to stop the machine alone, but together, it painted a mosaic too damning to ignore. The military's Internal Ethics Bureau launched a parallel inquiry, and for the first time in years, Cernic was not untouchable. Lena's name circulated in whispers and reports, in closed-door briefings and quiet acknowledgments. The narrative shifted. She was no longer the insubordinate rogue risking cohesion. She was the anomaly who had forced accountability. Even those who disagreed with her method could not deny the result. A massacre had been stopped before it began. When the report was finally declassified months later, the public was only given the outline. An officer's refusal to follow ceremonial protocol triggered a review of command conduct that averted unauthorized military action. The words were clinical, neutral, but among those who knew the truth, it was a bombshell. In the barracks, Lena kept to herself. She refused interviews, denied visitors, and ignored messages from civilian groups trying to make her a symbol. She had not acted for glory. Her reason had been deeply personal, rooted in a memory she hadn't spoken of since she'd enlisted. It was a village in the borderlands where her mother had grown up, a place erased long before Lena wore a uniform. Her mother had never spoken of it, only cried when the news of its burning reached them. It was stabilized too, though the official reports called it an accident, an unfortunate misfire during a rebel purge. But Lena knew better. She had joined the military not out of blind patriotism, but with the hope that somehow, from the inside, she could prevent another Myravel, another village erased without a name. Now that long-held purpose had finally collided with action, and she was no longer alone. Officers she had never met began sending her handwritten letters. "You reminded me of why I enlisted," one of them wrote. "You stopped me from becoming something I couldn't live with," said another. They were private messages, personal, but they fortified her. In a way, they were salutes, not the formal kind, but real acknowledgments of her stand. Elior, too, visited her one evening, not in uniform but in civilian clothes. He didn't say much, just stood beside her at the window and looked out at the lights of the capital in the distance. "There's still a lot to fix," he said eventually. Lena nodded, her eyes never leaving the horizon. "Then we better start." The courtroom was silent as Captain Elira stood on the witness stand, her uniform crisp and pressed, her shoulders squared with the burden of truth and defiance that had brought her here. The tribunal chamber was stark, sterile, its walls lined with somber faces, generals, diplomats, journalists, and foreign observers. The air was heavy with the weight of accountability, long overdue and now impossible to avoid. A single camera light blinked at the back of the room, broadcasting her testimony to the world. She took a deep breath, her voice steady as she recounted every detail, the commands she refused, the orders that went against everything she stood for, and the consequences that had followed. Her refusal to salute Commander Bragg had not been a moment of rebellion, not just an act of insubordination, but a final act of protection for the innocent people of Merin, who would have otherwise paid the price for a madman's thirst for control. As she spoke, she knew her words were now rewriting the official record, casting a light on the dark corridors of military power that had gone unquestioned for far too long. The tribunal proceedings, though emotionally grueling, revealed a chilling web of intent behind Bragg's campaign. Documents unearthed from encrypted military servers confirmed Elira's suspicions. The planned detainment of Merin's male population under fabricated accusations of insurgency, the forced relocation of entire families under the guise of strategic defense, and the documented protocol for what was internally referred to as civilian containment, a thinly veiled term for mass imprisonment and cultural erasure. Each piece of evidence submitted in court built the picture Elira had tried so hard to prevent from ever materializing. Had she saluted that day, it would have signaled her complicity in a chain of events too dark to bear. But she hadn't. And that decision had made all the difference. Outside the courtroom, the public response was seismic. News channels around the globe picked up Elira's story. Her face became a symbol of principled resistance. Her image featured alongside words like hero, truth-teller, and guardian of conscience. But she remained grounded, avoiding interviews and refusing any offers of political endorsement or media deals. She hadn't done any of this to be celebrated. Her focus stayed on Merin, on ensuring that those whose lives were nearly shattered by war would be remembered not as victims, but as people whose dignity had been preserved, thanks to the few who had spoken up. Meanwhile, Commander Bragg's fate was sealed not by Elira's testimony alone, but by the cascade of internal reports that began pouring out once others in the chain of command saw her courage. Lower-ranking officers, many of whom had feared for their careers or even their lives, began stepping forward with their own accounts, some corroborating hers, others adding entirely new layers to the scope of impending atrocities. The prosecution grew stronger with each passing day, painting Bragg not as a misguided leader, but as a calculating architect of terror. The verdict, when it came, felt almost too calm for its significance. Guilty on all counts of attempted war crimes, unlawful military orders, and abuse of command. He was sentenced to life in confinement, stripped of all rank and recognition, his legacy shattered by the very truth he tried to suppress. Elira didn't attend the final day of sentencing. She had already moved on from the halls of judgment to the fields where healing was needed most. She returned to Merin not in uniform but in civilian clothes, walking through the streets where she had once seen fear etched on every face. Now those faces greeted her with cautious hope. She volunteered with the rebuilding efforts, using her logistics knowledge to streamline the distribution of aid, quietly doing the work that brought lives back to normalcy. Children who had once run from military uniforms now ran toward her with laughter, offering her drawings and flowers they picked from the hills that were once stained by the threat of war. Months later, a school was built on the edge of Merin where the worst of the detainment camp was meant to rise. It was named the Elira Juno Institute for Peace and Conscience. She had protested the name, but the townspeople insisted. To them, she wasn't just a captain who said no. She was a human being who remembered what it meant to be human, even when every force around her tried to make her forget. And for that, they would never let her legacy fade. In the years that followed, Ilira became a quiet advisor to humanitarian organizations, helping shape ethical training programs for soldiers deployed in volatile regions. Her work helped draft new international codes of conduct that emphasized individual accountability in military chains of command, ensuring that what almost happened in Talmarin would never be repeated elsewhere. Her story became required reading in war colleges and human rights academies, not because she had done something extraordinary, but because she had reminded the world that ordinary courage, at the right moment, could change everything. One day, while sitting beneath the olive trees outside the school bearing her name, she was approached by a young girl holding a small notebook. The girl asked if she could write about Ilira for a class project. Ilira smiled, nodded, and asked why she chose her. The girl, no older than 10, said simply, "Because you made my home safe again, and because you reminded grown-ups to listen to their hearts, not just their orders." Ilira looked out across the quiet town, the distant hills swaying in the summer breeze, and realized that this, more than medals or trials, was the true measure of victory. Not what had been prevented, but what had been allowed to grow in its place: peace, truth, and the unstoppable legacy of conscience. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.